Hello, everyone. My name is Neha Anand, and I'm a marketing manager here at Riverside Insights. To join us for our webinar, Standardized Testing and Eligibility Determinations, Considerations During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Today, I'm proud to introduce Joe Clays and Beth Varner here from Riverside Insights. We're excited to have them here today. During the presentation, please leave any questions you may have in the Q&A box. A recording of today's presentation and CE units to those who qualify, as well as certificates of attendance, will be sent to all registrants by the end of the week. The recordings from our previous webinars can be found on our website at info.riversideinsights.com/clinicalpd. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Beth and Joe, and we can get started with today's webinar.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Clays. In the way of an introduction, I was a school psychologist for 16 years. During that time, I was an adjunct instructor for a graduate assessment course, and I was also a contract trainer for Riverside for a number of years for their clinical products, including the woodcock-johnson 3, the Stanford Binet, and of course the BDI. And then about 7 years ago, I joined full-time as a clinical assessment consultant.
My name is Beth Varner. I'm also a school psychologist. I've practiced in Alaska, where I'm from originally, Washington, where I did my school psych training program, and California, where I currently live. I'm also a licensed educational psychologist in the state of California and have been working with Riverside for just about 6 years now as a clinical assessment consultant. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic is a unique situation that none of us have encountered in our lifetime, and it's demanding new things from educators as we're all learning to support students during this difficult time. A big part of Joe and my jobs in our assessment consultant role is to support school psychologists, special education teachers, and other users with using the assessments that Riverside publishes. And we found ourselves being asked quite a few common questions during the pandemic, and today's session is designed around these questions, addressing some of them. So some of the content might be a refresher of your early assessment courses, but it's always good to go back and make sure you've updated your understanding so you're more equipped to apply it to the current conditions that school psychologists and other school staff are working in. The premise or thesis of our session today is that as school psychologists, our training is already geared towards dealing with the unique and challenging situations, and it's equipped us to effectively assess students during this time. So even before the pandemic, school psychologists and school assessors, we've been well versed in approaching each student as an individual, documenting their unique assessment profile. We're also very skilled at documenting kind of group level or regional factors that might be impacting the experience of a student. And that equips us to account for some of that regional variance that we're seeing in experiences with the pandemic. And more than anything, we're great at doing the best we can with the resources that we have available to us. And that's definitely a skill that the pandemic has required from everyone. Another thing that we've been trained to do that continues to be important during the pandemic is conducting a multi-source, multi-method evaluation that examines a wide range of data in order to draw conclusions about a student's eligibility. It's always been true and continues to be true during the pandemic that we should never use test data as the sole source of data for determining eligibility, right? We need to look at a number of sources. I've included here excerpts from the National Association of School Psychologists practice standards and the federal language that guides this practice. And really doing this multi-source, multi-method evaluation, it continues to be essential in the context of the pandemic. So today, during our time together, we're going to discuss a few of these sources of these data, including norm reference standardized assessments, and then also the contextual data that allows us to accurately interpret student scores.
A common question we've been getting is, do we need COVID-19 norms? So we're going to begin by delving into the process of how norms are created and the metrics that are derived from those norms. I think that by better understanding those issues and the available metrics, we're going to be able to confidently navigate standardized norm reference assessment during the pandemic. We'll start by reviewing the expansive norm sample that represents students from a variety of backgrounds and educational experiences. We also go beyond those common metrics and consider instructional zones as well as scores reflecting proficiency that will provide us with more robust information. Then we're going to discuss contextual factors, such as exclusionary factors and the individual familiar factors that should be considered when looking at eligibility. Finally, we're going to walk through some eligibility questions as case studies, and hopefully that'll show you how to apply this information. Arguably, the primary advantage of norm reference data is that it provides us a reference group by which students we test are to be compared. The concern, of course, is whether that reference group is representative of the child we're testing. That concern has become even more evident, I think, with COVID-19 and the subsequent shutdowns, and of course the eventual remote learning situation that many students are receiving. And this is a valid concern. Whenever we have students that have had unusual impact to their education, we should be very careful when interpreting their scores as a perfect comparison to the norm sample. For example, I've had students that were moved numerous times due to several different foster care homes and eventually referred for a special ed evaluation. Now, in those cases, treating the scores as a perfect comparison score certainly wouldn't be advisable. However, I would argue that the true value of norm reference assessment is that it brings dimensionality to our understanding of the test taker. It provides us a way to judge the relative strengths in some areas of academic and cognitive functioning with the relative weaknesses in other areas of academic and cognitive functioning. And it's through that sort of analysis that I think we can find patterns that are indicative of a learning disability. As I mentioned before, we have to ask, we have been asked whether we need COVID-19 norms, and I think that that's best understood by going through the process involved in generating norms. Just to use the WJ4 as an example, we collected test scores from over 7,000 individuals. Those participants came from geographically diverse communities across 46 states. The examiners all had to be trained. And they also received training on the test itself, and there were trained examiners beforehand, which included a 5-hour online course with test-by-test video modules, embedded practice exercises. The examiners themselves had to achieve minimum passing scores before completing the 3 practice test administrations, and then we had project staff review those administrations to ensure they were proficient and provide feedback. So altogether, that took 25 months to complete. In short, what I'm saying here is that creating norms for an event like COVID-19 isn't feasible, but the data we get from the current norms still has tremendous value, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, for those that haven't delved into the details of the technical manual in a while, let's just run through some of the highlights real quick of what's produced and, of course, how it's useful. Once we have that the data itself, it generally forms a bell curve shape, and I'm sure everyone is aware of that, with most of the scores centering around the mean, and then, of course, fewer scores towards the tails. This shows up on all kinds of different dimensionalities of human performance. The most commonly used scores that we look for as test administrators, are things like the standard scores and the percentile. And without getting too far into the mathematical details, the norm data allows us to find the mean score and the standard deviation by which we can get those scores. While everyone's familiar with the mean and standard deviation, the standard deviation, I do think sometimes trips folks up a little bit. So one way to understand it is that it's simply the bookends of that big hump in the middle. So we have a illustration here It can be visually observed, in fact, which I don't think a lot of people realize, because it's actually that inflection point, and I've highlighted that in green here, where the curve goes from being concave up to concave down. That's your one standard deviation. And then, of course, we just double that to get 2 or 3 standard deviations. So notably, I would say that I do get a lot of calls where people are confusing the standard deviation with the standard error of measurement. Interestingly, that standard of measurement does have a lot of useful purposes for evaluating kids, especially when we're looking at differences between scores. So we are going to talk about that a little bit today, and so you'll be able to see these side by side and see the differences. The SCM, or standard of measurement, is a measure of the reliability of our scores, which can be very useful when interpreting scores, particularly when it comes to looking at differences between the scores. So, we're not going to do any math today, so don't worry looking at this equation, although it's a really simple equation. The equation for standard of measurement is just the standard deviation times the square root of 1 minus the reliability. So in the way of an example, if you're familiar with confidence intervals, the SEM is the 68% confidence interval. But in the way of an example, an IQ test that has a reliability of 0.7, what would the SEM be for that test? So, we take the 15 times 1 minus 0.7, the square root, and we get 8.22. The SEM can be useful when interpreting scores, because if the separation between the bands is greater than the width of the wider band, we can assume a significant difference exists between the different tests that we're comparing. And conversely, if they overlap, we can assume no significant difference. And this is going to be useful because a lot of tests don't necessarily give you, every single comparison that you may want. So in those cases where you want to make some individual comparisons between tests, sometimes looking at the standard error of measurement is the way to go. So, to get the 95% and the 99% confidence intervals, we're just going to multiply by 1.96 or 2.58. And we're not going to explore those values today. Simply know that conceptually, the standard error of measurement is related to test reliability, in that it provides an indication of the dispersion of the measurement errors that when you're trying to estimate a student's true scores from their observed test scores. And that's different from, as I noted earlier on that bell curve, the standard deviation is a variation from the mean and is notable as the point where the bell curve goes from being concave up to concave down. So let's go ahead and try to apply this so you can see what I'm saying, so it's not so esoteric. Oftentimes you get asked again about score differences. Maybe our platform doesn't provide a difference between scores that you want to look at the comparison of, and or other tests, for example. You may want to make some other kinds of comparisons with other tests, and it's not provided in the platform, and that's where the SCM comes in. Here's how: if the standard error of measurement bands overlap, then we can assume no significant difference exists. Alternatively, if the separation between the bands is greater than the width of the wider band, we can assume a significant difference exists. As I've said before, this sort of differential analysis is of real diagnostic value. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in our case studies. The one caveat I would add is that we aren't controlling for multiple comparisons here. Okay, so you just can't go through and look at a listing of all the differences and try to come to some inferences, because you're going to have errors of multiple comparisons. What you want to do here is you want this sort of analysis to be done a priori. In other words, beforehand. So, for example, if the child was referred for a reading problem, then we're only going to look at the relevant comparisons related to reading. And that's are also supported by other data sources. We're looking for that convergence of data, not just some difference that hangs out there by itself and then hanging our hat on that as an interpretation by itself. We want to have multiple sources and convergence of data to come to an inference. Now, there are other common metrics that people expect, like age and grade equivalence, and yeah, I am going to talk about those today. I would agree that age and grade levels are often misused as a measure of skill level, so we're not going to be using them that way today. In fact, we're not actually going to be using the precise value. We're going to be talking about ranges, and we're also going to be talking about how we're using them. We're not using them to determine skill levels. And I'm sure you guys know this. It's problematic for a number of reasons. I'm sure most in the audience have heard before, so I'm not going to go through those again today. But where they can be helpful is identifying the range where the curriculum might be most effective. And also I think it's useful when talking to parents and teachers sometimes to use language that they're more familiar with. So in this example, we have grade levels, but more importantly, we have a range of levels that are based off the RPI. And we're going to talk about the RPI in more detail in a couple of slides here. So just hang with me a second. Looking at this slide, the grade levels for the tests and the composite are found above the shaded area, which represents a zone along which the grade level, the grade development scale. The lower point of the scale is where the student will find reading to be easy, and the upper range is where the student will find reading to be difficult. Now, along the right there, you can see that there's an RPI, a standard score, and a percentile for the student's performance on reading on those measures. So let's take a minute and focus on that shaded area there. We use terms easy and difficult, but you might be more familiar with terms like independent or frustration level, or maybe your teachers are and parents. So feel free to use those terms instead when describing the instructional zone. If you're familiar with the RPI, the easy level is an RPI of 96 over 90. In other words, where the average student achieves 90%, we would expect this student to achieve 96%. So obviously a very easy task for them. Conversely, the frustration level begins after an RPI of 75 over 90, which is to say the student would achieve 75%, where the average student would achieve only 90%, or would achieve 90%, not only, but actually 90%. That's really good. Or maybe you're more familiar with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. You could ask, or you could use terms like tasks the learner can use without assistance, tasks the learner can do only with assistance, and so on. So where these were all addressing the same phenomenon. So don't get too hung up on the terminology. Use whatever you think is relevant for your particular audience. And that's kind of the purpose of this, is that I think these kinds of terms are sometimes more useful in a IEP meeting or an eligibility meeting when talking with parents and teachers versus trying to explain things like standard scores and things of that nature. So circling back to the score profile, we can see that his grade level in reading is right at the student's frustration level. But if you look over the standard scores, you can see that that's actually in the normative range. In other words, looking at their norm reference scores, we might conclude the student is an average reader, and they are, in fact. Their scores are in the lower 90s. But while that might suggest the student isn't disabled, it doesn't mean that he or she might not need considerable assistance with grade level material, particularly since we're talking about reading here in this particular example. Sometimes textbooks that are for a particular academic subject, like history or particularly science, are actually written in grade levels above their grade level. So, a fifth grade science book, maybe actually the reading level of that may be 6th or 7th grade. So that's important to keep in mind also when you're looking at context and where the difficulties are occurring at. So let's dig just a little bit deeper into the instructional zone and see how it's constructed. I think it'll make a lot more sense here. We use what's called a W score. And now all you need to know is that that's an equal interval measure, like on a ruler, how each inch is the same size. Comparing it to like a percentile. Percentiles are not all the same size differences, or in fact, most of our metrics are not same size differences. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as a CSS or change sensitive score. Something like this is available on most modern tests. Most of your modern tests nowadays are constructed using a Roche-based interval measurement of change. The range is constructed by encompassing 10 W units or change sensitive units below the individual's ability and 10 units above their ability. And these bands are going to vary in size because periods of little growth are wider than periods of rapid growth. And I want to sit here and meditate here and leave it on the slide for a second and consider that, I'm just going to say this again, the two examples you see here for written expression and calculation, they're the same size. I know you're looking at them, it goes from 7.4 to 25. The other one goes from 5.8 to 6.8. But they're the same size, right? They're 10 units up, 10 units down, 20 W units wide for both of these. Their size varies due to the variation in their growth rate. So I know that takes a minute to, you have to meditate on that a while to kind of, for it really to kind of sink in, but it's important to understand, and we're gonna have some slides a little later that hopefully flesh this out and make it more intuitive for everyone. So let's examine why that happens in more detail. In this example, we're comparing retrieval fluency with calculation. And here's what you need to know. Again, areas of little growth have less variability. In other words, the standard deviation is small. We're using standard deviation here, not error of measurement. Whereas areas of a lot of growth have more variability. In other words, the standard deviation is wider. So which one has the wider standard deviation? I know it looks a little counterintuitive because it's the one with the shorter band. It's calculation. So in this slide, the REFW, or reference W, is where the average student was scored. So take a look at those reference W scores on that one. On retrieval fluency, the student scored 496, which is about 7 or closer to 8 points different from what the average student, But the standard deviation is only 3.65. So the student is almost 2 standard deviations away. Whereas on the calculation test, the average student scored a 526, and this student was a 504. Now that's almost 22 points away, but the standard deviation is 16. So it's actually closer to the average score than what occurred on the retrieval fluency test. Now, I realize this may be the first time some folks have looked at data this way, and it may take a while for that to sink in. And we're going to be hitting on the same concept next when Beth talks about measures of proficiency. So all of this is tied together, and keep that in mind. Go ahead, Beth.
To ensure that we're taking a comprehensive view of students' performance, we might also want to consider measures of proficiency. And one example of that is the Relative Proficiency Index, or the RPI. So this score gives us a mean of documenting the student's proficiency, or quality of performance would be another way to put it, on different tasks. And it gives us a statement of likely success, how likely they are to be successful for similar tasks based on performance within our standardized assessment. And I'm going to kind of go through and explain the RPI here for a little bit. An example here is that if Maria receives an RPI score of 34/90 on an applied mathematics task, we would say that on an applied math test, where an average same-age peer, the most typical peer right in the middle of the bell curve, would demonstrate 90% accuracy or proficiency, Maria would achieve a 34%. And this number here immediately gives us a sense of the student's real-world classroom performance in a way that standard scores just aren't equipped to do. So let's briefly contrast the standard scores and percentile ranks with this new measure that we're talking about, the Relative Proficiency Index. Standard scores and percentile ranks are both norm-referenced ordinal scales that reflect an individual's relative standing. Relative standing means where they fall in comparison to their peers. We've all said or heard this 1,000 times in eligibility meetings. When you line up 100 students, your child's age in order of their ability in this area, your student is number, whatever the number is. Sometimes in this description, we use language that kind of implies that a standard score can tell us about how well a student can do a task, when in reality it can't. The limits of an ordinal scale just tells us what order the different points along the line are, is it doesn't tell us anything about the distance between the students in that row of 100, and we're going to see a visual demonstration of that in a minute. So a standard score and percentile rank only tell us what proportion of a student's peers can perform this task with more skill, better than the student, and what proportion would perform with less skill. The RPI, on the other hand, it reflects the quality of performance. It reflects how well they can actually do it. It's a criterion referenced equal interval scale that tells us how accurately a student can perform a task. RPI scores range from 0 over 90 to 100 over 90. And you'll notice that that denominator is always 90. That's because we're comparing our student, as Joe mentioned before, to an average peer who demonstrates 90% proficiency on the task. So 90% is commonly used as the threshold for mastery. So this comparison tells us when the material is at a difficulty level where a normatively average peer would demonstrate mastery, our student would perform at whatever level is in the numerator. So as another example, if our student received an RPI of 45 over 90 on spelling, it's telling us that when an average peer would receive 90% on a spelling task, our student would receive a 45%. Because the RPI is an equal interval scale, similar to a ruler where the distance between inches is the same, we can say that they're half as proficient as an average peer. And that's something that we can't do with an ordinal scale. We can't say, for example, that a student with a standard score of 50 has half as much ability as a student with a standard score of 100. Ordinal scales don't work that way because we don't know the amount of ability contained in each point along the scale. But an equal interval scale allows us to make these statements. So in this case, we can report our student has half the proficiency of a typical peer in the area of spelling. A good analogy for the RPI is the Snellen index. And this is the way that we report visual acuity. So for example, when I say I have 20/40 vision, that's using the Snellen index. 20/40 vision means that I have to be at 20 feet to see something with the same clarity as a person with 20/20 vision can see at 40 feet. So I have to be closer to it in order to see it clearly. What we know about the human body is that things like vision decline with age. That means that the visual acuity score that we would call, quote, normal or average, right? Those between 16th and the 84th percentiles, that's going to change over the lifespan. And we can see that in this table here. It shows the percentiles for each age and level of visual acuity. So what we see is that poor visual acuity becomes average, or, the typical performance in older ages. And this is a great demonstration of the limitations of a relative standing metric. So let's say that Jesse is 65 and they go to the DMV to renew their driver's license. The person behind the counter asks them how well they can see, and Jesse responds, "Great, my vision's at the 55th percentile for my age, completely average." How much does this actually tell the person behind the counter whether Jesse can see street signs or small things jumping out in front of their vehicle? Well, not very much. What they need to know is not Jesse's relative standing for their age, but instead their quality of performance. It would be much more useful for Jesse to say, "I have 20/70 vision," in which case the person behind the counter would require them to wear glasses when they drive. In the same way, when we're in an evaluation meeting and say that Jane has a standard score of 79, which puts her at the 8th percentile rank, this is really important information. In many states, it's the information that eligibility is based on. But what if we want to know more? What if we want to know what intervention group to place Jane in, or we want to answer a parent's questions about how well she can actually do math? It would be much more useful to be able to say, when a typical average peer can complete a task with 90% proficiency, Jane would receive a 25% on the same task. This is a score that teachers and parents immediately relate to, and it has much more instructional relevance than relative standing. So let's look at a visualization of the RPI. Let's say that these 4 creatures are running a race. And if we were to rank their performance with standard scores and percentile ranks, their scores would be entirely based on relative standing, or what order they are in the race. So we see the horse is at a percentile rank of 1, the sheep is at 25, our great firehouse dog is at 75, and then the greyhound is at 99. What these scores don't show you is how far from the average performance each racer is. So let's say that these same 4 creatures run a second race. You can visually see when we look at this compared to the previous one that their performance in the second race is very different. They're more spread out. The Dalmatians at about the same point, but everyone else is a lot more spread out. But you'll note that when we just look at relative standing, their percentile ranks and standard scores, their scores didn't change. And that's because their order in the race, their relative standing, is still the same. It still goes horse, sheep, Dalmatian, greyhound. So let's go back to the first race and apply a proficiency score to their performance. In this case, the horse, who's in the back of the pack at the first percentile, receives an RPI score of 75 over 90 because he is at the back of the pack, but he's actually pretty close to all the rest of the other racers, right? So when an average creature running a race would do so at 90% proficiency, our horse would demonstrate about 75% proficiency. It's not terrible. Now let's return to the second race though. The horse is still at the back of the pack at that first percentile, but in this case, their RPI score is 58 over 90. They're running this race more slowly or with less proficiency than they did the first race. And the RPI gives us a score that reflects the slower performance that isn't picked up by measures of relative standing, but would be visually obvious to anyone who's observing the race. Often, depending on the area being measured and the age of the student, RPIs and standard scores tend to trend together. If one's high, the other is often high. If one's low, the other is often low. But sometimes, particularly in younger children, the standard score and the RPI can appear to be telling different stories. So for example, we might have a student with a standard score of 71. That's about 2 standard deviations below the mean, which is making us think they might need eligibility or goals in this area. But look at their RPI score. That's not half bad. When a typical peer would complete a task with 90% proficiency, our student is getting an 83. That's within average proficiency. Or on the other hand, we might have a student with a standard score of 86, one that we might be considering exiting. That's just low average. That's not terrible. But when we look at their proficiency, we see that they only demonstrate about 2/3 of the proficiency of an average peer. So why does this happen? This happens for a number of reasons, but a common explanation that we're going to focus on today is that abilities develop differently and people are more variable on some tasks. So this chart is a cross-section of WJ4 cognitive scores over the lifespan, and it gives us a visual demonstration of how these abilities develop differently. So when we look at this chart is also available in the technical manual for the achievement and the oral language, but the cognitive kind of shows these differences more clearly. So that's why I use that. So when we look at this chart, let's look down at the bottom at long-term retrieval, this kind of light blue dotted line. What this is telling us is that long-term retrieval is a skill that is more or less in place around age 12-ish. And doesn't change much over the lifespan. The growth curve is very stable. You kind of have what you have around age 12, and that's what lasts you through your life. On the other hand, a skill like cognitive processing speed, we see this is a skill that grows rapidly. It's a very quick growth curve, a high slope that shoots up until what? Your early 20s when your frontal lobe stops developing, and then, does other things later in the life that we're not going to focus on. But the slope of these lines, the speed at which a skill grows based on the age of the student, is one of the primary explanations for why our standard scores and percentile ranks sometimes look like they conflict, even though they don't. And I'll show you here in a minute.
Thanks, Beth. And this isn't theoretical. We see that scores on our tests do behave this way. We still have bell curves, but their shape, which is technically called kurtosis, it can be very different from more platykurtic, which is more flat, to leptokurtic, depending on the trait and the age at which it's measured. So, if you're at an age where the curve is steep, the scores will be more spread out or platykurtic. Whereas, if you're at an age where the growth curve is flat, then there's little variation, and thus it would be more leptocurvic. Now, let's go back and look at those examples. Average proficiency with a low relative standing is occurring on those scores later on the previous graph, where the skill has been acquired by most individuals and thus less variable. And by later, I mean older. So if you recall that graph that Beth was showing us, the lines went up and then they tended to flatten out in some way. Some more flat than others, but they all seem to get a little flatter. So those happen at that upper age, and again, that's where average proficiency with low relative standing is likely to occur. Now, low proficiency with average relative standing. Now, that's occurring on tasks that are still being acquired, and there's more variability in the group. This is what you're more likely to run into as a school psychologist, because we're not typically working with individuals over the age of 21. So kids that are younger, you're more likely to see low proficiency with average relative standing. Those with low proficiency might be normatively average, but the proficiency score is giving us a yellow flag. It's suggesting that the individual may need additional support. And as school psychologists, we're often termed gatekeepers, for eligibility, but I think that our role really should be expanded to providing assistance and interventions for kids that don't qualify. So using that RPI sometimes can be very useful in those meetings when I recall when I first became a school psychologist, kids didn't qualify, and then we all just sat around and stared at each other at the table. I'm arguing that they're average and everything's fine, and the teacher's saying, well, but he's struggling on all these things. And the RPI is actually something that should correlate more with what the teachers see, because they're actually seeing that low proficiency. So now you can address that. You'll see it also, and you can address it and talk about what kinds of interventions might be most useful for them. If you're going to use the RPI, you'll probably want some descriptors for your report. And we have charts with various kinds of descriptors, whether you use functional, developmental, or proficiency-oriented descriptors is really up to you based on the type of evaluation that you're doing and what the data is being used for. And we should have this available, I believe, as a handout. If it's not in the sidebar there, you can reach out to us and we can get that for you. Since many students during the pandemic may be falling behind due to interruptions in their curriculum, as well as emotional impacts or difficulty retaining information in alternative modes of instruction like Zoom, the RPI, I think, can be very useful to measure, a very, very, very useful measure to determine whether additional support may be necessary. Beth?
So we've discussed considerations when using norm reference tests during the pandemic. And the fact that creating new COVID time norms isn't a feasible solution. We've also discussed the utility of instructional zones and proficiency scores when considering student performance. So now let's discuss a few more factors that are particularly relevant to the evaluation and eligibility determination process that we're currently doing in light of the pandemic. So this passage should be familiar to everyone. It outlines a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math and limited English proficiency as exclusionary factors for eligibility determination. What I'd like to remind everyone is that these are exclusionary factors just for the special education eligibility itself, not for the use of norm referenced assessment as data sources. So we've heard some school psychologists or other school staff express concerns about using norm referenced assessments on a student who might have experienced gaps in their education due to COVID. And when I've had these conversations with folks, what I try and remind them is that working with students with an inconsistent educational history is not new to our practice. When I was working in the schools as a school psychologist, I evaluated students who, maybe due to a foster placement or other home-based factors, they changed schools incredibly frequently, introducing quite a bit of inconsistency into their experience with the curriculum. Also pre-pandemic, I've worked with students who had experienced, let's call it a less supervised version of homeschooling, who appeared to have gaps in their educational history. I've also worked with students who experienced extended absences and reduced access to curriculum due to medical issues. And in each of these cases, the inconsistency in their educational experience is an important factor when considering the context for the standardized assessments when we're making our eligibility determinations. But that history alone isn't an indicator that a norm reference test would not be appropriate for the student, just that their scores need to be interpreted in context. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on all of our lives. It's trite to say that, but it's true. It's had broad mental health and socioeconomic status impacts. And we know that the data indicates that these effects are disproportionately impacting people of color and individuals and families experiencing poverty. Similar to the way that a student's educational and language background should be considered as context for assessment scores, the impact of the pandemic on the student and their family is important contextual data when we're interpreting standardized assessment results. So every school psychologist has assessed students experiencing homelessness, poverty, parental unemployment, illness of a family member. That all occurred prior to the pandemic and also is occurring during the pandemic. These students still deserve a comprehensive evaluation that gathers all relevant data, including norm reference standardized assessments. And it's essential that the context of the child is considered and well documented in the assessment process. And to that end, our colleague, Dr. Tammy Stevens, has created the COVID-19 Impact Profile Checklist. This is a free resource. It's also in the handouts. If you haven't found the handouts in the sidebar there, you can find the slides, this, and the RPI chart that Joe is referring to, all in one document. This is available in both Spanish and English in that handout, and it's a free resource that please feel free to share with anyone who might benefit from it. This is a 2-page form that allows you to document the psychosocial, socioeconomic, and education impacts that the pandemic has had on a student. This is a really excellent form that allows you to collect all of this relevant information in one place for use in our report writing. So we've talked about the use of norm reference standardized assessments and the importance of thoroughly documenting the contextual factors that should be included in the documentation of the student's performance. How do we use this information to make our eligibility determination? Let's look at a few examples. So a quick refresher to set the stage. There are 2 pieces to special education eligibility. 1, does the student meet the criteria as being a student with a disability? And 2, do they demonstrate a need for specially designed instruction, or do they specifically need special education in order to make progress in the curriculum? When we're considering eligibility both during and after the pandemic, it'll be important to make sure that we're carefully considering this distinction. So some of the disability categories listed here are ones in which a sudden onset disability can occur, particularly the more medically related categories. So it's entirely possible that a student, for example, who never would have qualified prior to a major car accident, then has an associated traumatic brain injury and does qualify for services when they return to school after their injury. We need to keep in mind, however, that outside of these instances, particularly in the case of specific learning disabilities, evidence of the disability will likely be present in the educational history, including in the pre-COVID data. So keep in mind, as we look at these case studies, we're going to look at 2 students who were referred for a suspected specific learning disability, and kind of walk through the decision-making process.
Okay, well, in our first case study example, we have Marissa Garcia. She's a 14-year, 11-month-old student in 9th grade. Her parents have reported through academic history that she doesn't enjoy reading. No other significant developmental history was reported. Typical academic development prior to the pandemic. The current academic concerns are low work completion in the remote learning environment that she's been experiencing during the COVID-19, And parents have also observed high frustration with large projects or reports, and she has a particular difficulty in science that she's been struggling in. And that difficulty in science has varied throughout her academic career. She's never necessarily been real comfortable in science, but recently it's gotten to the point where they felt like they wanted an evaluation to look more closely at this and see what's going on with her reading skills. So the first thing as a school psychologist that we're likely to do is, of course, compile all that information from the referral and, eventually sit down with a student and test them. And the first scores we're probably going to look at are those areas of reading, since that is the referral question. And the first types of metrics that we're likely to look at, because this is what we've been trained to do, is look at the standard scores and the percentiles. And we have those right here for everyone to take a look at. And as you can see, looking at those standard scores, most are falling within that average range with, a couple in what some people would call maybe a low average range, but within the standard deviation of the mean. So within those bookends is kind of what we're looking at here. Now, again, when we're talking with parents and teachers, we probably have to include standard scores and percentiles in part of the conversation, obviously. But, I found it very useful to use their language as much as possible. And that's kind of what we're advocating for here again today is that, using things like instructional level can be, I think, more useful in understanding a student also, as well as conveying that information. So, as school psychologists, just to be clear to everyone here, that we're not making an eligibility determination based on the grade levels. I'm not arguing for that at all. We have the standard scores for that. That gives their an understanding of their normative standing. But using terms that folks are familiar with can go a long way to understanding the data. And in this case, we can show that Marissa's scores, are normatively average, but she is functioning at the frustration level for her grade. And, as I mentioned before, often textbooks for subjects like science can be grade level for the content, the actual science content, but written at a much higher reading level. And in those cases, it's often helpful to pre-teach vocabulary. Particularly in this case with Marissa, that might be one of the interventions we talk about, is pre-teaching the vocabulary. In fact, some of those books, I would argue, are backwards in the way they put their chapters together. They have the kids read the chapters, and then, in some of the books, they'll have vocabulary at the end, and maybe even some questions at the end. Sometimes even reading through those questions before reading the chapter, so they know what to look for. And of course, understanding the vocabulary before they get started might be enough to get a student that's right at that frustration level to a level where they're able to understand the material better. So as we noted, her reading is normatively average, but at the frustration level. Let's take a look and see also if she has any relevant processing deficits. Her language skills are normatively average or above. The WJ4 cognitive and oral language indicates typical performance on tests measuring reasoning, oral language, and knowledge. So, looking across these scores, there's no apparent normative concerns in cognitive and linguistic abilities that typically contribute to reading and spelling difficulties characteristic in individuals that have reading disabilities or dyslexia. You may notice some scores falling into the low average range, potentially some proficiency concerns around some memory tasks I see. One of the lexical access scores or tests might draw your attention, or maybe the verbal attention score. But let's look at our profile of scores and see if they're really that different. Now, this is where we're going to tie in that SEM, that standard error of measurement that we discussed earlier, and see how it might be of value in a case like this. And what we see, looking across the composite scores for her profile, is that it's rather typical of what we might find of a normally developing student. nothing appears to deviate significantly. This is the profile of a student that you might randomly pull out of a hallway and test. You're going to see some differences of sorts, small differences, but none that are significant. And that's what we're seeing here. If you look at the widest band and seeing if they overlap, that's kind of the conclusion you might draw with a profile like this. Now, looking deeper at some of the relevant processes related to reading, we see there's nothing that significantly departs from the average range or is significantly different from the rest of her score profile. So again, we're looking for a separation between the bands that's greater than the width of the wider band. And again, we're not seeing anything like that. And this is the value, again, of a test like a norm reference test. This is when I was talking earlier about dimensionality, is looking at those comparisons and the tremendous value that they have. Now, of course, they also have value when you don't have them, because you can show that this is a typically developing profile. Now, the student may need additional assistance, of course, but nonetheless, how we typically define disabilities, maybe not. But let's go into the case study a little bit more. Test scores never tell the whole story, so let's review Marissa's case. We administered the COVID-19 impact checklist, and we do find that she and her parents have contracted COVID-19. She has been withdrawn during the quarantine, but no prior mental health issues. Fortunately, her parents were able to maintain employment during the pandemic, and Marissa was able to attend remote instruction. However, her participation was low and the work completion was inconsistent. Ideally, what we'd like to see is a convergence of data that suggests a learning disability. And in this case, the student does operate in the frustration level. And again, as I noted, may need additional assistance, pre-teaching vocabulary and perhaps some other interventions that we as a team might decide. But the evaluation does not appear to reveal evidence of a learning disability that requires specially designed instruction. And the one caveat I would add in here is that eligibility determination varies from state to state. But I'm just talking generally speaking, in most states that I've worked in, this is a typically developing profile. Beth?
So our second case study is Antonio. Antonio has an October birthday, so he turned 6 early in his kindergarten year, which means that right now he's 8 years, 0 months in the 2nd grade. When we look at his, let's go through some of his historical data and his current academic concerns. When we look at his kind of developmental and family history, we see some patterns that are common in students with specific learning disabilities. We see that his parents report some speech therapy, difficulty pronouncing new words as he was learning to speak, and currently he has difficulty remembering the details of a story that has been read aloud. Also, we have a significant family history. We know that his father, uncle, and grandfather have all reported difficulty learning to read and spell. And his father has also reported some attentional concerns. We also see that Antonio has had some academic difficulties that have been present since kindergarten. When we go back and look at his pre-reading process, he did not like to look at print when listening to books that were read by others. He had difficulty with learning to rhyme, remembering letter sounds, doing the segmentation and blending, some anxiety and frustration about reading, and avoids and does not prefer to read aloud. Looking more at his current academic concerns, we can see that he's having trouble learning phonics, he's been slow to develop his sight vocabulary, and he sometimes substitutes similar looking words when reading and has trouble reading longer words with 2 or more syllables. When we look at his WJ4 achievement in these primary areas of reading and spelling, we can see some low performance across the board. And this is true both when looking at relative standing, his standard scores and percentile ranks, as well as a measure of proficiency, the RPI. Both he's experiencing concerns. So when we're looking here at kind of this profile look, we can see again where his placement would be is kind of that dotted line at 2 second grade first month. And his performance is quite a bit lower than that, both based on both standard scores and percentile ranks. When we look into his cognitive and oral language, we can see that on test measuring reasoning, oral language, and knowledge, his scores are pretty typical, kind of that core intelligence is pretty typical. But when we look more deeply at areas in those cognitive and linguistic abilities that are typically indicative of reading and spelling difficulties, that's really where we see the concerns pop up. We see looking at, again, both his standard scores and percentile ranks, and also zeroing in on his relative proficiency index, we can see that he has more concerns in these areas. Here's a few more. We can see some processing speed areas here. So now let's look at this band question here. We know that criteria for special education, it varies from state to state. So in this example here of Antonio's scores, we see differences that in many states would be found diagnostically meaningful. So first we can see a discrepancy between Antonio's oral language ability and his reading skills. Some states might want us to look at the difference between his reading skills and maybe his verbal IQ or an overall IQ or cognitive score. We also see evidence of a processing deficit in the area of phonetic coding, that in some states that might be part of your eligibility criteria, is also identifying a processing deficit. So regardless of whether that processing deficit is required for your eligibility process, knowing that it exists, identifying that phonetic coding is a processing deficit, it's currently of diagnostic value and interpretive value as we move forward with supporting this student. And again, we're not looking at every possible discrepancy. These are chosen beforehand as being meaningful for the referral question. So together, we're going to look at our background data, teacher report, parent report, qualitative observations, and we're looking for a convergence of the data. In what direction does all of our data point? Using the standard error of measurement allows us to choose those data that we believe are relevant, while also assuring that we're looking at meaningful differences. So looking at Antonio's COVID impact profile checklist, we can see that he did experience the death of a close family member, his grandmother, due to COVID. His family noted erratic sleeping patterns during the quarantine. His father also lost his job, and the family experienced a socioeconomic impact of that. Antonio was engaged in remote instruction as he could, but often came to class appearing tired, and his connection was frequently lost due to an unreliable Wi-Fi. So when we look at our eligibility considerations, we see some processing deficits in areas that are predictive of a reading disability. We see a history of underachievement that's documented all the way back through kindergarten. And then we also see a current academic impact. And in most states, this student would be found eligible for special education. So while the pandemic might have exacerbated the impact of the student's disability, this evaluation appears to indicate a disability that existed prior to COVID and demonstrates a need for specially designed instruction, that second part of the eligibility. So in summary, the COVID-19 pandemic requires that school psychologists choose assessment tools with robust normative data sets and use those tools to their greatest capacity. Hopefully, we'll be gathering information beyond just standard scores and percentile ranks. It also requires us to consider exclusionary factors, as well as the individual and familiar factors that color the lens that we use to interpret the student's performance. The good news is that each of these elements are things that our training programs have equipped us to do. So while the pandemic is unprecedented in our lifetimes and is pressuring us in new and challenging ways, adhering with best practice in this content relies us to lean back on our training and dig into the best practices that serve as the foundation of our professions. So thanks so much for coming today. We have a couple questions that we want to make sure that we address. If you're able to hang out with us for a minute, we'd love to have you. Joe, one question that came up that a few people asked was asking about remote assessment and kind of the role that remote assessment is playing now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, so first of all, our colleague, Tammy Stevens, has done a whole session on remote assessment, and we may have that available. Our test is available as a virtual test book. So if you click on the resources tab in the WJ Score platform, you'll see that we have some virtual test books, and I'm sure other publishers have or are looking at how to make their test available online. As far as validity is concerned, that's going to vary from examinee to examinee, and it's really incumbent on the examiner, whether you're doing remote assessment or not, to make the call as to whether you're getting good data. So, you know, this is a part of validity, is having the examiner there to evaluate that. One way to frame this is the same way we deal with accommodations. We often test kids with disabilities, and our test manuals address using accommodations for those students. The standards for educational and psychological testing say that it's up to the examiner to determine whether the inferences, you know, accurately reflect the intended construct rather than some other disability. So, you know, to make that very real for you, you know, on a math test, you know, if there's reading involved, you know, you may read that to them because we don't want to re-measure their reading skills on a math test. There are likely to be situations where you know, you're just not getting good data, and that may come up even more with remote assessment. Absolutely. You know, testing very young children, for example, versus testing a sophomore in high school may be more problematic. And so, again, just to circle back, you know, you're going to have to make that call. You know, and it's going to be on a individualized basis, just like most of our testing is. You know, with students in special education, we have to, you know, look at that context and decide whether or not we're getting good data. One question, just to dovetail real quickly, I saw in here someone asked what we mean by statistically significant. And I wanted to address that because, you know, we did use that term a lot, and if other people have that question, you know, statistically significant is you know, when we do use the word significance in this case, one way to think about it is, you know, if you had one score that was you know, 103 and another score that was 104, you know, would you talk about that? I think intuitively, you know, you wouldn't, because if you were to test them again, those two scores might flip. You know, there's some level of error involved in this sort of testing, and we can actually account for that error, right? We know what it is. That's the standard error measurement. And so when we say something statistically significant, one way to understand that, I think, is just to take the word statistically out of there. It's actually a meaningful difference that you can talk about. If it's not statistically significant, for our purposes, it's not significant at all. We can't talk about 1-point differences or 2-point differences. And, you know, how many point differences can you talk about? Well, you know, we actually know that through the standard error of measurement. And someone else asked, you know, what about other tests that I give from other publishers like the KTEA or the Wyatt? The standard of measurement will be in the examiner manual. So you can look that up yourself, and you can then, of course, look at, you know, what standard deviation or what you know, if you want it to be, you know, 95%, you know, if you want 68%, it's just a standard error measurement, right? So if you're looking at 68% confidence, you just use a standard of measurement. If you want it to be 95% sure, then take that standard error measurement times 1.96. If you want to be 99% sure, then just take that standard of measurement times 2.58. And that's all you have to do. So you can do this on all tests. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, but there's so many scores. But remember, you don't want to do it for all scores. You only want to do it for the scores that are relevant for your referral question. You know, if you're doing it for all the scores, then actually you have to do a lot more complicated UM math. You have to do like a Bonferroni correction for multiple comparisons, and that just adds, you know, some unnecessary math into this endeavor. Trust me, you just want to do the ones that make sense for the referral question. So with that, Beth, do you have any others?
Yeah, we've had quite a few questions about the location of the handout. So just kind of a quick technical note. If you look at your control panel in your GoToWebinar panel where you have the audio options and such, you'll see a little portion that says handouts, and you can download the file from there. The first set of pages are screenshots of the slides, and then the last few pages are the COVID checklist and the RPI interpretation chart. Another question another technical question about getting a recording of the webinar, that's going to go out after the fact. One question that I did want to address is someone asked about explaining the difference between a normative strength and weakness versus a relative strength and weakness. And when we talk about a normative strengths and weaknesses, we're talking about the gap between the student's performance and the norm sample. So when we look at, a standard score, typical score, the average being from 90 to 110, if we have a student that gets a standard score, for example, of 70, this is a normative weakness, right? Their score is significantly below what is typical based on their age or grade. When we look at a relative strengths or weakness, we're doing an intra-individual, so within the student comparison. So then we might see, for example, let's say that the student's overall cognitive ability is 85. If that student receives a individual score, maybe on processing speed or math or reading, of 80, that's very close to their own ability and is likely not a statistically significant strength or weakness. So it becomes are you comparing the student to themselves, or are you comparing the student to the norm group? If I have a student with an IQ of 120, getting a math score of 100 might be an intra-individual within themselves weakness. That's a relative weakness for them, even though we know that a standard score of 100 is not a normative weakness. It's completely normatively average.
And another one I wanted to quickly address here. Can you please give us suggestions on reporting standard scores and RPIs for our FIE? I don't know what an FIE is with this. We have a lot of states and they use different terms. I'm going to assume that has to do with an eligibility meeting. But if the standard score reports average, but the RPI reports very difficult, how do we address that in reference to eligibility? And again, when it comes to eligibility, I think I threw out a caveat earlier, but I'll go ahead and say it again. It's hard to address eligibility because every state has their own eligibility criteria. What I can say is that in the 13 states that I cover, none of them are going to be using an RPI for eligibility. It's always going to be norm referenced for eligibility. What we're arguing is that the RPI and, of course, instructional zones do give us additional information about the student that can be relevant to intervening. So, not every student necessarily gets special education, but, just because they don't qualify for special education doesn't mean that they might not need additional assistance. And that's where the RPI, I think, comes in. It becomes useful, is you can talk about students that, while not disabled, are still struggling. And I think that if you ask this in the abstract from people, and I think they've actually done some surveys of this where people ask, is every student that struggles disabled? And I think that, you'll get 90-some% of teachers saying, no, of course not. Not every student struggles is disabled. And that's what we're talking about here with the RPI. Not every student that struggles is disabled, but we still want to identify those struggling students and provide them with an intervention. And that's what the RPI brings to the table, at least currently. Maybe a state would decide to use something like that. But currently, my understanding is in most states, in fact, in all states probably, that's not the case. So you would continue to use whatever your state criteria is, which likely includes normative scores or some sort of RTI type of scenario. Now, of course, in RTI, that maybe the information could be used there. I don't know. Again, with eligibility, I'm going to have to say again, you have to consult with your state departments and of course, the leadership in your own school district for answers to questions like that.
And another question that's coming up is, what about these kids that are getting gaps, right? What about these kids that weren't able to engage in remote learning, weren't able to participate? And kind of what I hope that you heard in our presentation today is lean back on what you would have done previously, because I doubt this is the first time that it's come up in your career. If you were working with a student prior to the pandemic who had significant family issues, had significant, was moving frequently, was in and out of foster placements, was whatever it might be, that they wound up with a gap. We've had students that just show up in the schools and say, yeah, they haven't been in school for the last couple months. What do we do? We're going to address this in a similar way. Yes, this might be happening more frequently now, but it's not a new situation per se. So you're going to want to make sure that you consult with your special education leadership and have conversations about how are we factoring in these rule outs and whether we're going to potentially proceed with an evaluation or not, and how are we going to consider their current ability within the context of their missed school. So again, we're confronting this more frequently now, but unfortunately, it's not new to evaluation teams.
Okay, well, I think that we've gone over time.
Can I answer one more question? Sorry.
Sure.
One more question that came up is how do we get the charts that we displayed in the presentation? A couple people have asked, what reports do I run? And if you want to look at the bands to see whether the bands overlap, under report type in the online scoring system, you're going to choose profile report. And that's, you can choose based on age or grade or standard score percentile rank. So you're going to want to choose a profile report for those. And then if you want the charts that we used in the case studies that kind of break down what are the areas that are kind of overall ability and what are the areas that are predictive of a reading or writing disability, those are actually part of the dyslexia report that is available if your district or organization purchases the upgrade for the online scoring system called the WIP, the WIIIP. That has a comprehensive report and a dyslexia report. And those charts that I showed were from the dyslexia report.
Okay, well, I think we've actually gone over time. So thank you for majority of people for sticking around for the questions and everything. And you know, if you do have any issues or anything specific that you need addressed with our tests, of course, you can reach out to your clinical assessment consultant. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. And thank you for attending.